Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Avi Grossman. This is Parashat Talk, and today we are very privileged to have Rabbi Yaakov Nagen join us. He's going to speak about his adventures in the interdenominational world, the relations between Jews and other religions, our neighbors here and abroad, and also a little bit about the Parashat, God willing. Rabbi Nagen is a Ram in Otniel, in the yeshiva there, if I'm not mistaken, correct? And
Correct.
also, I think that quite a few of my neighbors and friends have studied under Rabbi Nagen. I forgot to mention to that beforehand. We have regards from some of them. We'll talk about them after the broadcast. And this week we read about how Yaakov Avinu escaped to Haran. He was bidden to leave the comforts of Eretz Canaan, Be'er Sheva. He left from Be'er Sheva, but interestingly enough, he returned to his family in Hebron. Apparently, Yitzchak Avinu would live in both places. And he was also told to get himself married, and that he did quite a lot in Haran in the span of just a few years. What I think, if you do the chronology right, he married 2 women within 8 days, and then another 2 women within the next 4 years or so, and had about 12 children, at least according to Pshat. So Yaakov did well, but still, this brought him into conflict once again with some family members, Lavan especially, that was his uncle and twice over father-in-law. And then, of course, when he went back, next week, we'll read about it, he had to return to Eretz Canaan, and then the encounter with Esav once again. Rabbi Nagen, we know that eventually the sages used Esav generously, Esav and his nation Edom, as a stand-in, a symbol for first the Romans, and then Christian Europe and Christianity as a whole. And also they took Yishmael, Yaakov's and Esav's would be his uncle. He is basically the symbol for Islam in the Torah. And whenever we have Yishmael and the other half-brothers, the Bnei Keturah, they represent, at least in the Midrashim and the Zoharic literature, they represented the Islamic world. What can we learn as Jews about our relationship nowadays with the Islamic and Christian worlds?
Well, I think one of the message of the Torah is that there are conflicts between brothers, but conflicts ultimately are overcome. We know that the 3 great conflicts between brothers, you have Yitzchak and Esav, we have Yitzchak and Ishmael, Yaakov and Esav, Yosef and his brothers. Each of these 3 stories ends with a scene of reconciliation when they come together to bury their father in the Marat HaMachpelah, in the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, which is not far from where I live. I live in the hills, the Hebron Hills. And if you look at it, we see that it's a process. We know that with Esav, he softens up, and ultimately he kisses Yaakov, and both of them wept. And the Netziv points out, the Netziv says that it was Esav that gave the kiss. It's a singular, but v'yivku, and they wept. Both Yaakov and Esav cried together. And then Netziv says that this happens often, that with the Jewish people, that the non-Jewish world often takes the initiative in trying to recreate the connections. Understandably, we are traumatized, so often it's harder for us to open up. But after Esav, he brings the example of Antoninus, the Roman emperor, who was a close friend of Rabbi, of Yehuda Nasi. And I think in our times, we see a phenomena with the Jewish-Christian connection. Throughout history, Jews suffered by the image in Christianity of being the accursed wandering Jew who gives witness to God by our suffering. And ultimately, in the 1960s, in Vatican II, the church changed their perception about the Jewish people, saying they are now our elder brother who still have a covenant with God. So here we have a initiative to try to rectify part of the relations. In fact, just last week, I heard a very moving story about the Pope John Paul
The first or the second?
What?
The first or the second?
Oh, the one from Poland in the 1980s.
Okay, that'd be the second. Okay, yes, the more recent one, yeah.
Okay, so at a ceremony commemorating 25 years for the change of the church's approach to the Jews, they invited a number of Jewish speakers, and one of them, the Pope asked, "Where are you from?" He says, "Well, my family's where lands mentioned because my family's from Poland," and the Pope says, "Well, my father's from Poland." So the Pope says, "Well, what did your father tell you about the Polish?" He said, "Well, he's telling me they're all anti-Semites." So the Pope says, "It could be that's true, but I want to tell you a story. I was 16 years old when the Nazis came to the school that I was studying, and they rounded up the Jewish teachers and shot them. And then he said, I myself, I thought maybe we might be next. And I said, if somehow God gets me out of here, number one, I'm going to devote myself to something to help the world. And number two, if I ever get to a position of influence, I will use it to try to help the Jewish people." And in fact, he was one of the most important popes in creating connections between Am Yisrael. But my specialty living in the Hebron area is actually with Islam and Muslims. And here too, I see the Hebron could be a source, in the world sees it as a place of conflict. But a lot of the negative things are true, but there's another dimension. And together with the Jewish community in Hebron, led by their spokesperson, Arnon, Noam Arnon, there's a dialogue continuing with Muslim leaders in Hebron itself. So I could share some stories of that relationship. One of the leaders of a Chamulot is like a clan, once asked me to write a letter to the Machat. The Machat is the commander of all the Jewish soldiers in Hebron.
Okay.
Called Yiriv, and to try to tell him about him, to realize that their people could be allies to. And the day I wrote the letter was the day that my son was sworn into the Israeli army, into the Givati brigade at the Kotel. And we were told that he will serve in Hebron. In fact, he was in Hebron for during that very difficult period in 2016. So I wrote to the Machat. They said, "You should know today my son was sworn into the army, and every Friday night I give him the bracha that he should come back bishalom ima shalom, come back in peace and with the peace. And you're responsible for the peace of all the people in Hebron, and know that there are many people there that also could be partners in trying to for the better of all the people there." I sent a letter to the Machat. I sent also to my friend, and the Muslim friend called up afterwards, says, I'm praying for your son and the other soldiers. Everyone should come out bishalom. And sometime later, I was at another interfaith meeting with in the house of Rav Yoel Schwartz. He's a very famous rabbi in Israel. He's written a lot of books about Bnei Noach.
They give me his Parsha sheet every week. I just got it now. They printed it up yellow. He started off with a few psukim. He says you have to make sure to observe Yud Zayin Kislev and not or Kaftet in November as we know it. Yes.
Okay. And at the meeting, the translator was so moved by a meeting between these different sheiks from Ramallah and the Rabbanim, she started crying. She was a little bit embarrassed, but afterward I gave her a ride back to Hebron that night, and she says to me, "Do you remember the letter that you wrote to the head of his clan?" I said, "Of course." He said, "I was with him when he got the letter, and he says he wants to understand every single word." So I translated every word, and she said, "The way I cried tonight, he cried when I read him the letter." So there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of terror. In fact, when we finish, I'm going to a askara 20 years from a neighbor who was one of the first victims of the second intifada, killed on the road near us by terrorists. But it's more complex than seen from the outside. There are also a lot of people that do seek for connection, and hopefully that Hebron, which in Hebrew comes from the word chaver, friend, and in Arabic it's al-khalil, meaning the friend, referring to Avram Avinu, who's the friend of God, Bezat Hashem, this will be a place of connection.
So let me ask you, I think I'll ask on behalf of, I think my father would want me to ask this question because he's not watching.
Okay.
Unfortunately, you mentioned the idea of terror. We see, for example, major terror groups seem to do this, especially in the name of Islam. Hamas, I hope they don't have as large a presence as people think they do in, let's say, the Hebron area. But they claim to be very devout Muslims. In your experience, do you think the real devout Muslims are pro-Hamas, or are they more for coexistence with non-Muslims?
Okay, well, there's the good news and there's the bad news. The good news, I think, overall, most Muslims are not supporters of terror.
Okay.
The bad news is all you need is a small percentage to really wreak havoc. But there's so many. But I think ultimately, if you go back to, I've studied very, very extensively the Quran and the early commentaries. And the overall message of the pshat of the Quran is very respectful of Am Yisrael and the Jewish people. Most of the Quran is a retelling of the story of Am Yisrael, including the connection of Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, and even famous things that people hear that Jews are like pigs and apes and monkeys. The context where it appears in the 7th surah of the Quran, it's a town that were Mechalel Shabbos, and because they weren't, and a third were Mechalel Shabbos, a third kept quiet, and a third gave them rebuke. And when they didn't listen to rebuke and they continued to be Mechalel Shabbat, it says that God tested them by sending many fish to the shore on Shabbos, and then they were over Chilo Shabbat to gather them up. And then God said, but because you're Mechalel Shabbat, you are like apes and you are like pigs.
Okay.
So therefore, it's not a blanket statement. It's a critique. The critique in the Quran is often of Jews not keeping the Torah. But as always things, there are later commentaries based on a lot of politics that have explained things often different to the pshat, saying that whole parts of the Quran have been abrogated. But I'm in constant dialogue to try to return things the way they should be, that the Jews acknowledge as Ahlu Kitab, the people of the book, are given the acknowledgement and respect, and I think it should be in both directions. We know the Rambam has much praise for the absolute belief in the unity of God in Islam, and hopefully this could be something which is strengthen all of us. Am Yisrael doesn't think that everyone should be Jewish, and in my understanding, it's within Islam there's a fulfillment of the mitzvot b'nei Noach, and a fulfillment of what the HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from humanity, and they more and more should and often do acknowledge that they are a branch from the story of Am Yisrael. And I just read a book by a professor from Medina in Saudi Arabia saying that if you undermine Am Yisrael, you undermine Islam, because the Quran says that part of the proof is the Jewish people are proof for the events which ultimately Islam builds on. So I think ultimately we have so much to gain by giving respect and legitimacy to each other as being over the Hashem. When Rav Yoel Schwartz, when I had to meet different Muslim leaders, he always quotes the pasuk in Tehillim, Chaver li kol yerecha, that all who fear God are my friends and my brothers. So to go back to that inner level of who we are, people have faith and fear of God, and from this place to connect to each other.
Okay. You and I know that certain American forms of Christianity, which are basically mostly Protestant forms, are very pro-Israel and are very much on our side and give a lot of money. And they're some of our, I guess I would hope, our closest allies. And I don't believe that they try to missionize us. So that's good. But we also know that Rabbi Soloveitchik had a lot to say about how the foundation, or sorry, the founding of the state of Israel was good for many reasons, among which was that it repudiated a lot of the ideology of the Catholic Church. Rabbi came from a tradition that felt that the Catholic Church, which is not the Protestants, the Catholic Church had a certain latent hostility toward the Jews, and that their theology is based on the rejection of the Jews, that they're the wandering Jew and they're cursed. Do you think that the Catholics have mellowed out sincerely since the founding of the state, or in the recent decades?
It's not thinking. It's a fact. Meaning, one of the dramatic events in Catholicism was Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, that in the 1960s they got together 2,000 of the bishops, and other than a tiny handful, they changed the whole ideology.
Okay,
about, before, right. The Jewish people being not responsible for the death of Jesus, coming out against anti-Semitism and seeing the Jewish people as the elder brother of Christianity, and dialogue with them would be fruitful. This is an incredible change, but part of it took place because Jews were willing to encounter. If Rav Soloveitchik in his 1964 article Confrontation has keeps things very separate, Avnei Yeshua Heschel has an article No Religion is an Island, showing how we're all ultimately interconnected, and he had a pivotal role in the terminology of Vatican II. At some point he heard that they wanted to keep in a phrase saying that they hope in the future that the Jewish people will join up with the churches, something that implied still a hope for conversion of Jews. Right. So he went to Rome, and the time they said that he can meet the Pope came out the night of Yom Kippur. But he said this is pikuach nefesh, and he walked over and he went to the Pope, and he told the Pope that if I have to choose between the gas chambers of Hitler or to convert, I will choose to die like a Jew. And the Pope was so moved that he took out a pen and he crossed out that whole section. And apparently the Pope had read the books of Heschel and quoted him. So I think if we want to change the world and bring the world to the vision of the future that talks about the world shoulder to shoulder, calling in the name of God, we have to be active. We can't. We have responsibility to do something. That if the Jewish people should be v'nivru chabad, to bring blessings to the world, to bring light to the world, you can't. You have to do something about it. But I think this is a fundamental issue. I think part of the essence of Rav Soloveitchik's whole theology is more that Torah is much more abstract and above life in reality. Whereas other approaches, I think in Eretz Yisrael would see that somehow Torah is connected to life, reality, and history. So there's something. So seeing that there is a process that we're part of, and feeling we have responsibility, the same way that the nevuot, the prophecies of Shivat Zion, of the return to the land of Israel, took place because people were active about it. So too, the prophecies about the world being connected under Malchut Hashem will need our active involvement with this. And so we can't so to say that we don't want to have anything to do with anybody else, and we're each so unique that we have nothing to offer or learn from anybody. I don't think this is a path to bring us to the Geula.
So now I need to ask you, you mentioned that we discovered as Jewish people that part of the path to Geula is actively, let's say, seeking to move back to the land of Israel and to found a state, which if you would study, let's say, the Talmud, you realize, yes, that's what God expects of us. God expects of us also perhaps to move toward rebuilding the temple. And as you know, the temple is supposed to sit on a place where the Muslims have a few shrines and a mosque on the Temple Mount. And people say that the very idea of the Jews always praying that they rebuild the temple, and you know there are many people go on the Har Bayit every day to pray, they feel threatened by that. And they used to tell us, I guess, now since the Trump time, they've been saying it less, but we used to think that a religious war would break out if I do such a thing. What do you think now? What do we do about that?
Okay, so first of all, let me mention I'm a close friend, and until he moved out, a neighbor of Yehuda Glick, who is the symbol of strengthening the connection of Am Yisrael to Har HaBayit. And
Rabbi Glick left Otniel?
After his wife died, and he got remarried, and now he's living in a place where location not mentioned because of Muslim extremists. And
let me just give it for our viewers. Rabbi Yehuda Glick was an MK and also famously survived an assassination attempt a few years ago one night. Didn't try to kill Feiglin, who was standing right next to him, but they tried to kill him. And also, for those of you, our regular Shammai Glick, Rabbi Glick's nephew, will be joining us in, I believe, 3 weeks to discuss these issues. So stay tuned. Please, Rabbi Nagen.
Okay, so, but it's a question, how do you look, the Muslim connection, the Muslim connection to Har HaBayit it's on one hand, it could be looked at as a very big and painful headache. On the other hand, we could look at it also as ultimately, long-term, as a great blessing.
Okay.
People would say that Har HaBayit is, if they were totally irrelevant to the world, to feel that this is going to be the center of the world would be really a far-off fantasy. But to say that Har HaBayit, which is supposed to be a Beit Tfilah L'Kol Amim, a house of prayer for all of the humanity, that we have so much of humanity sees this as a holy spot, ultimately this is a blessing. In fact, I'll tell you, in one of my faith groups, we were studying the topic with Muslims of the Beit HaMikdash, and we read the Tefillah of Shlomo HaMelech that says that let Hashem should listen to the prayers of the Nachri, of the non-Jew, Sheba Mirachok, who comes from far. Now, the word Al-Aqsa means the far away mosque. So one of the Muslim leaders says here, they're responding. Shlomo says we should listen to the Muslim who comes from afar. And here, this is, Al-Aqsa is the mosque which is afar. Because the Muslim connection to Al-Aqsa is the 17th surah of the Quran that tells about night journey of Muhammad to Al-Aqsa. And it's clear that it's talking about the Beit HaMikdash, because it talks about the two Beit HaMikdash that were destroyed, and talks about a future of a third Mikdash, or a return to the land ultimately. There are coins that were minted by one of the early dynasties, caliphs, that has a pictures of a menorah on the coins itself. So I feel the connection. In terms of the actual building of the details, this we might need for Mashiach, but to realize that the fact that the Muslims should realize that this spot is sacred because this is where the Beit HaMikdash was, and Jews should realize that it's a blessing that Muslims come and pray there to Hashem Echad because this is what we were hoping for in Sefer Yeshayahu. But it's a question of getting out of the politics and finding this path to see that we could be there together.
You could pass on this question, or you could say no comment. Do you go to the Temple Mount at all to pray?
Yeah, yes, I do. Of course, only after going to the mikvah, because I think most of the opposition of Jews going up is simply either amaratzus or because they're scared that people are not going to do it right. But it's clear from all the sugyot, you have to go to a mikvah, and you can only be in the parts that are Har HaBayit, but not in actually where the courtyard stood at the Beit HaMikdash. Now, there are areas which are clear that it's not the courtyard. So if you are Tovel, Har HaBayit is the one place that we're allowed to do full bowing down. And I feel so I feel it's a tremendous privilege to go there, and I think if so yes, I go, and once on our anniversary I went up with my wife. It was a very long line, and I thought we wouldn't get in, but then I told the guard, and we were zocha to to go up to Har Bayit.
Okay, I ask officially. I'm not to take any position on that issue, so I like it when other people are able to express their feelings and also give a little bit of halacha on that one. For those who are listening, it's because I want to try to encourage people to get ready for the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. I want it to be something. I don't want to turn people off from that which I'm trying to teach them about, specifically Korban Pesach. That people should get ready for this year, God willing. We'll do Korban Pesach and we'll be able to use the Haggadah. I don't want to turn people off by telling, I go up in Har Bayit or I'm against doing so. So thank you for taking that position. Let's turn to the Parsha a little bit, although I did want to ask you how you got involved in all this. I guess we'll have to do that some next time, but we have to actually speak about the Parashat. So the Parashat starts, at least according to what Rashi brings in the Midrashim, with a godly encounter on Har Bayit. Of course, as the Dot Mikra and others point out, it seems that Yaakov was in a place called Luz, that he named Beit El, and that's where he returned to in next week's Parasha. So he could not have been on Har Bayit, and that's why we have to have the Medrash as brought by Rashi, and as I love what Rabbi Dessler has to say about that, but that's not for now, trying to explain how it is he was in both places at the same time. And the Kfitzat Derech and the way the ladder went, that's beyond here right now. But it says Yaakov Avinu, he woke up and said that he didn't know that there was God here. And then he exclaimed that this place is quite awesome. Awesome not in the American colloquial sense, but awesome as full of awe, like it should be with proper translations. Now, obviously, Yaakov Avinu stopped where he did. It says Bambakom, at the place, and slept there. The Midrashic approach, which it does say that this is Har Bayit, says he specifically did want to go there because he knew the Akedah was there and all the history of the place. And even if it wasn't there, he still knew it was the proper place. So what does it mean that he woke up, he didn't know? He did know. He just what do we learn from that?
Right. So in fact, that verse that Yaakov awakens and realizes God is in this place and I did not know. In fact, there's been even a book written by somebody, Rabbi Kushner, that from this one verse giving many paths to discovering God in our lives.
Okay.
I could share, I thought maybe two of them that seem to contradict, but ultimately we need both of them.
Okay.
Through the words, I did not know, there's something redundant because in the Hebrew word yadati already includes the I. So that extra I becomes very important. One approach of a student of the Baal Shem Tov, Rav Pinchas of Korvitz, says that because ultimately Yaakov did realize that God is here. How did he do that? Because I did not know. By not knowing his I, by not knowing his ego, and they're telling the idea of the Baal Shem Tov that the way to discover God is to free yourself from your ego.
Okay.
The ego is the great divider between ourselves and each other. It could be in a marriage relationship. And people see themselves but not the other. And so too with God. The Baal Shem Tov says on the pasuk in Devarim, Anochi omed ben Hashem ubenchem. I stand between God, you and God, which in the Pshat is referring to Moshe Rabbeinu, who is communicating between the Jewish people and God. Here it becomes the I, the ego, which stands between us and God. So his message is, if you want to really experience God, you have to free yourself from this ego so you could go see beyond yourself. Now, Rav Kook would have said exactly the opposite. Rav Kook always writes about that the way to get to God, if you don't know yourself, how could you know God? The way to get to God is looking deep inside of yourself, into your neshama, into your soul. If you truly know yourself and see your deepest inside in that discovery of your I, there is your place of contact with the divine. But of course, there really isn't a contradiction because each of us have different layers of identity. There are things we want to free ourselves. Our ego, which gives birth to our anger and our negative emotions, to free ourselves from that ego. But on the other hand, there's something inside of me that I want to develop. So we have to always not make a mistake. What's the I that I want to develop and listen to? And what's the I, the ego, I want to free myself from.
I didn't think of it that way. Normally, pshat in Hebrew is if he didn't know himself, he would have added let's say the word et, which usually points to the direct object of the verb. So when he says anochi lo yadati, the pshat would be I didn't know, but if he meant I didn't know myself, he would have said ani lo yadati et anochi or et ani. So I didn't think of that. I don't think many of us would have.
You'll never make it as a Hasidic Rebbe if you stickler with dikduk.
Well, they got musser to me also today because I was trying to show someone something. I guess, and not only that, I just realized something about pshat. They say that you could use trup to understand the psukim, and then I realized there's a lot of understandings in the Gemara itself where if you read it differently, you have to read the trup a little bit differently. You have to parse the pasuk a little bit differently than the trup dictates. And when I was working with Korean on the translation of the Steinsaltz Tanakh and its commentaries, I was, the members of the editorial board, they have discussions about how to translate things. And I was always the purist and said, we have to follow the pshat that follows the trup the most. And then I realized that just this year that perhaps you don't have to always follow the trup. You know why? Because the trup and the nikudot are part of the same layer of Torah Sheba'al Peh. But often, I'll tell us, don't just read it the way it's written with there's no nikudot. Change the nikudot, change the pronunciation of this word. And matter of fact, sometimes the Masorah even says that. Don't read the word that's in front of you. Change the letters a little bit. Change the dots and read it totally differently. And that's what the pshat is. So if we could change the nikud of a word and actually learn even straight halachot from that, so too we could change around the trup every now and then when necessary, because there is no nafkamina, and that also is a pshat. So I'm glad that people disagreed with me when I was being such a purist before, because you don't have to be such a stickler. The Torah has shivim panim, and it's nidreshet with a number of midot, and sometimes we forget those things. My wife works.
Of course, I was kidding. So I think even when you did make a drash, it's important for people to realize what is the pshat and what is the drash. So thank you for that, Duke.
Well, I think that now sometimes I hear a drash and I think that eventually I sleep on it. I think it's actually closer to pshat sometimes when you think about it. My wife works in couples therapy. Can you tell us something? Perhaps Yaakov Avinu, we mentioned, gets married 4 times this week's parasha,
right.
has a dozen children, and of course fights with his in-laws. What can I learn from this week's parasha before I have to go back home?
I think with his 2 primary wives, Rachel and Leah, it's a really very tragic situation because there are 2 aspects of couplehood. On one hand, we hope every couple has their inner connection, their love connection between them.
Yes.
And we also hope that they are blessed to have children together. Going back to in the story of creation, in Bereshit, the first chapter talks about male-female connections as bringing children into the world. In the second chapter, it's about the intimate relation between them themselves. Rachel, she was privileged to have Yaakov's love, but she was barren. She didn't have children. Leah had many children, but she didn't have the love. And unfortunately, each sister wanted what the other one had. Leah gives the names of her children, the names that hint about now maybe he'll love me because I have brought him all these children. Where Rachel says that if I don't have children, I think I'm just going to die. So it's tragic when these things are separate, but ultimately kind of a happy ending that historically each one was able to receive what they truly wanted. Leah so much wanted a connection with Yaakov, and as Leah was buried next to Yaakov in the Marat HaMachpelah. Rachel wanted so much to be a mother, and of all the matriarchs, Mama Rachel, she is the mother of Am Yisrael. But I think the hope is, and the blessing is the blessing that Ruth was given when she got married to Boaz, that she was told by the community, let your home be like that of Rachel v'Leah, that we should have a a relationship that has both the love and the children together. Bezat Hashem.
Okay. I thank you also for that, because now you answered the question my wife was asking me earlier. She said she was in Marat HaMachpelah, I think just this week. She saw two things that were remarkable, that they now have a tziyun for Esav, because the tradition says, and also the Muslim tradition says, that Esav's head managed to make it into Yaakov's burial place, which is quite interesting. That we probably have a lot to say about that, the meaning behind that. But she actually saw those marked in Hebrew, like this is to mark Esav also. And that where Leah is the tziyun for Leah, where she would be buried. And she said, why among all of Yaakov Avinu's wives did Leah merit to be buried next to Yaakov Avinu, and Rachel herself not? And perhaps maybe you would have think maybe Bill and Zilpah also had the privilege to be there, but we don't know where they're buried. So thank you for answering that for me, Rabbi Yaakov Nagen. I'm sorry we both have to go now, but this has been fascinating. And I hope to be able to pick your brain again, because it's there's so many words I want to ask you. So thank you for joining.
My heart.
Yeah, a heart. Sorry, the mind. I'll be like Rabbi Salvation. No, not brain. Will just be like that. I'd like to remind everybody: like, share, and subscribe. Send your questions or comments. And we thank Rabbi Yaakov Nagen one more time for joining us. Have a Shabbat Shalom and be well.
Thank you. Bye bye.